The history of the Tau Empire begins far from the ancient cores of galactic civilization. The species that would later challenge powers immeasurably older emerged on the world of Tau, a planet defined by harsh geographic contrasts and long eras of isolation. In Imperial classifications, the early Tau were not remarkable for great psychic presence, rapid mutation, or singular biological advantage. Their significance lies elsewhere, in the speed with which social reorganization, ideology, and industrial acceleration reshaped a society that had only recently crossed into modernity. Tau was a world of broad plains, storm-swept plateaus, and complex continental divisions that limited early global contact. Climatic extremes shaped settlement patterns, producing separated populations and distinct regional cultures. In this environment, conflict was not an exception, but a persistent condition of development. Competition for arable land, water access, and strategic high ground fueled recurring wars among tribes, proto-states, and expanding military coalitions. Early Tau warfare was characterized by direct confrontation, seasonal raiding, and later by organized campaigns as metallurgy and logistical planning improved. As time went on, these conflicts intensified rather than diminished. The planet's demographic growth and increasing urbanization produced greater demand for resources and increased political pressure. Rival polities began consolidating smaller groups through conquest or negotiated absorption, forming wider territorial blocs. Yet this consolidation, at this stage, Tau society fractured along lines that would later harden into enduring social divisions. Distinct cultural identities formed around occupation, environment, and regional tradition. Populations that lived in dry plains, rugged highlands, coastal zones, or dense urban centers developed different priorities and methods of survival. Political authority tended to concentrate around military leadership and resource distribution. In the absence of a unifying framework, distrust and ideological rivalry expanded as rapidly as technology. This period is crucial because it reveals what the Tau were before the emergence of their later imperial identity. They were a species in accelerated transition, technologically ambitious yet politically unstable. Their wars demonstrate both the capacity for disciplined coordination and the risk of self-destruction through escalating militarism. They had achieved industrial capability without achieving durable planetary cooperation. In many historical cases across the galaxy, such conditions end in collapse, extinction, or permanent fragmentation. The early record of Tau history shows a world caught in the momentum of conflict. Each victory created new grievances. Each innovation created new methods of killing. Each political consolidation provoked counter-coalitions. The trajectory was not toward peaceful unification, but toward an increasingly efficient cycle of war. The Tau homeworld thus served as the furnace in which their later empire would be forged, first through division and later through the sudden appearance of a force capable of ending it. The decisive transformation of the Tau homeworld occurred at the moment when its major powers were approaching irreversible planetary catastrophe. The industrial escalation of war had produced armies capable of continuous mobilization, mass artillery bombardment, and the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure. Diplomatic mechanisms among rival states had largely failed. The old tribal loyalties had expanded into national identities, yet these identities offered no stable path toward coexistence. The world stood on the threshold of global exhaustion. It is within this context that the Ethereals first appear in Tau historical memory. Their emergence is not presented as a gradual political reform, but as a sudden and politically disruptive intervention. Accounts vary in minor details across later imperial sources, but the central claim remains consistent. A new caste of leaders arose and began to impose unity across factions that had previously shown no capacity for compromise. The significance of this moment is not merely symbolic. It marks the beginning of a social system that would permanently reorganize the Tau species. The early Ethereals presented themselves as mediators rather than conquerors. Their initial influence was exerted through persuasion, negotiation, and the creation of a supra-tribal framework of allegiance. This was a critical shift. Rather than offering one faction dominance over others, they offered an ideology of collective purpose that could be shared without surrendering all local identity. In practice, this ideology served as an instrument of political centralization. Rival warlords and state leaders were persuaded or pressured into accepting a common authority, not only to avoid annihilation, but also to gain access to new structures of coordination. Unification did not occur instantly. The Ethereals had to overcome entrenched power networks, military elites, and competing strategic interests. They did so by presenting themselves as indispensable to planetary survival. They also exploited a reality understood by every major commander. Continued escalation offered no credible path to victory, only mutual destruction. The emergence of the Ethereals also coincided with the formal crystallization of distinct social castes. While specialized roles had existed earlier, the new system made them permanent and hereditary. This was not simply bureaucratic convenience. It created a stable distribution of labor, military duty, and governance that could be planned across generations. The Ethereals placed themselves at the apex of this system, claiming authority to coordinate all other castes toward shared goals. This produced a political structure with unusual resilience. Loyalty was redirected away from tribe or region and toward a centralized identity, reinforced by education, ritual, and social expectation. In the early unification period, ethereal authority relied on several connected mechanisms. First was ideological legitimacy, the idea that unity was not only useful but morally necessary. Second was administrative efficiency, the ability to manage resources, infrastructure, and reconstruction after prolonged war. Third was military integration, the merging of previously hostile forces into a single coordinated apparatus. The Ethereals did not abolish force. Instead, they reorganized it into an instrument of centralized policy. The military ceased to serve competing states and began to serve planetary consolidation. This restructuring produced an immediate material dividend. With large-scale internal wars reduced, industrial output could be redirected toward reconstruction and development. Transport networks expanded, communications improved, and resource distribution became more predictable. This era established the foundation for the later technological surge that would define the Tau as an... With the consolidation of political authority on Tau, the Ethereals faced a central problem common to all unified states emerging from prolonged internal warfare. Military victory alone cannot produce enduring stability. A society that has been shaped by generations of competition requires a new principle of legitimacy, capable of replacing the loyalties that once justified conflict. The solution adopted by the Ethereals became the defining concept of Tau civilization, the greater good. The greater good was not introduced as a minor civic slogan. It was constructed as a comprehensive political doctrine, one that redefined duty, identity, and social purpose. In its most basic formulation, it asserted that individual and local interests must be subordinated to the welfare of the whole. Yet in practice, it was far more than collectivist rhetoric. It served as the ideological glue binding castes, regions, and later alien species into a single imperial structure. It justified hierarchy while presenting itself as moral equality. It demanded discipline while promising mutual security. It offered meaning to sacrifice while directing that sacrifice toward state objectives. The historical function of the greater good can be understood as a tool of integration and mobilization. Internally, it allowed the Ethereals to transform populations that had once been rivals into cooperative components of a larger organism. It reduced the political legitimacy of dissent by redefining disagreement as selfishness rather than principled opposition. It replaced fragmented tribal memory with a narrative of planetary destiny. Through education and public ritual, the ideology became a normal part of civic life, shaping expectations of obedience and contribution. The doctrine also permitted an unusually smooth transition from domestic consolidation to external expansion. A unified Tau society required an outward direction for its momentum. The greater good provided that direction by framing expansion not as conquest, but as enlightened inclusion. In later imperial language, to be brought into the greater good was to be lifted, stabilized, and protected. This framing would later become central to Tau diplomacy, propaganda, and cultural assimilation strategies. It allowed the empire to present itself as fundamentally. The ideology's practical strength lay in its flexibility. It was simple enough to be taught widely, but broad enough to be adapted to changing circumstances. It could justify the organization of labor, the rigid structure of castes, and the direction of technological investment. It could also be extended beyond the Tau species, offering a conceptual framework for incorporating non-Tau populations without requiring them to abandon all distinct identity. Under the greater good, difference was permitted as long as it was subordinate. Diversity was tolerated as long as it was useful. This doctrine also provided the moral architecture for a political system centered on ethereal authority. The Ethereals positioned themselves not as rulers pursuing personal power, but as guardians of collective destiny. Their role was depicted as necessary because only they could perceive the needs of the whole and coordinate the castes accordingly. This claim did not require omniscience, it required belief. The greater good created the belief structure that made ethereal leadership appear not merely legitimate, but essential. Over time, the doctrine became embedded into every major institution. Military recruitment was framed as service to all. Economic planning was framed as efficient distribution. Scientific development was framed as progress for the collective. Even personal ambition could be reinterpreted as acceptable if it served communal outcomes. The ideology did not eliminate competition. The ideology of the greater good provided the moral justification for unity, but it required a stable mechanism to translate belief into daily life. That mechanism was the caste system, a rigid social architecture that reorganized the Tau species into specialized hereditary divisions. While earlier Tau societies had already contained occupational differences shaped by geography and tradition, the Ethereals transformed these differences into a permanent structure. The result was a civilization optimized for coordination, predictable labor allocation, and long-term strategic planning. The Tau caste system is commonly described through 4 primary castes alongside the ruling Ethereals. Each caste was assigned an essential function, and each function was treated as both duty and identity. Individuals were not expected to choose their role. They were born into it, educated for it, and socially reinforced within it. This produced a population with exceptional cohesion and efficiency, but also with limited flexibility and constrained personal autonomy. The Fire Caste became the military arm of the unified state. Historically emerging from warrior traditions and militarized regions, it was formalized into a professional force responsible for defense, conquest, and discipline. Fire caste culture emphasized obedience, endurance, and tactical proficiency. Over time, it developed a distinct institutional identity, reinforced by training regimes, command hierarchies, and symbols of service. In practical terms, the Fire Caste provided the Ethereals with a centralized instrument of force that could not be fragmented into rival armies as had happened before unification. The Earth Caste served as the industrial and scientific foundation of the civilization. It directed engineering, manufacturing, resource extraction, and technological research. This caste became the engine of Tau modernization, producing standardized equipment, infrastructure networks, and eventually the advanced weapons and starships that enabled interstellar expansion. The Air Caste assumed control of travel, communication, and later void warfare. Originally associated with high-altitude regions and environments requiring adaptation, it became specialized for piloting, navigation, and fleet operations. As the Empire expanded into space, the Air Caste gained strategic importance. It operated starships, managed logistics, and maintained the networks that connected distant colonies. This caste made it possible for the Empire to function as a coherent entity across interstellar distances, a requirement for sustained expansion. The Water Caste became the diplomatic and administrative interface of the Empire. It controlled negotiation, trade, propaganda, and many internal governance functions. Its representatives communicated the ideology of the greater good, both within Tau society and beyond it. Water Caste operatives developed techniques of persuasion and political management that later became central to Imperial growth, particularly when dealing with non-Tau species. In many cases, Water Caste diplomacy enabled expansion without immediate large-scale warfare, though it was always reinforced by the implicit threat of military power. Above all castes stood the Ethereals. They were the political and ideological core, claiming the exclusive role of directing civilization toward collective welfare. Their authority was presented as neutral coordination rather than domination. Ethereals were not framed as merely another caste. They were framed as the necessary element that prevented caste rivalry and ensured unity. By placing themselves outside the functional divisions, they positioned their leadership as the arbiter of all interests. The caste system also reshaped biology through social. Once the Tau homeworld achieved political unification and the caste system stabilized social functions, the civilization entered a phase of unusually rapid technological acceleration. This period was defined by the redirection of resources away from internal warfare and toward structured development. Where earlier industrial capacity had been consumed by conflict, it was now concentrated into coordinated infrastructure projects, standardized education, and long-term engineering programs. The result was not a slow evolution of tools and institutions, but an organized surge in capability, guided by state priorities and ideological discipline. The Earth caste became the primary driver of this transformation. Under the political protection of the Ethereals and the ideological mandate of the greater good, Earth caste research was treated as essential national service. Technological progress was framed as a collective defense against chaos, scarcity, and future threats. This gave scientific institutions unusual stability. Funding, labor allocation, and production capacity were insulated from factional politics, allowing continuity across generations of researchers and planners. The early focus of development centered on three strategic areas: resource management, communications, and industrial standardization. Tau society invested heavily in agricultural efficiency and water distribution, reducing the vulnerabilities that had historically driven territorial conflict. Transport networks expanded into continent-scale systems, linking distant regions into a functional planetary economy. Communication technology became increasingly sophisticated, enabling centralized coordination of production and administration. These changes may appear routine in isolation, but in combination, they produced a critical historical outcome: the collapse of regional isolation as a political force. Standardization was a defining feature of this era. The Earth caste developed common industrial designs, interchangeable components, and unified measurement systems. This reduced waste, simplified maintenance, and accelerated mass production. It also strengthened the state's control. Military technology developed in parallel. The Fire caste required a new identity as a unified planetary force rather than a collection of rival armies. This demanded common training doctrines and shared equipment standards. The Earth caste supplied this through durable firearms, armored vehicles, targeting systems, and improved battlefield communications. Fire caste doctrine evolved toward disciplined ranged engagement, reflecting both cultural preference and material advantage. Early Tau military design favored reliability, consistent supply, and coordinated firepower over individual heroism. Energy technology also advanced rapidly. Improved power generation supported industrial growth and expanded urban systems. In turn, industrial growth increased the scale of research programs and enabled larger technological leaps. This created a reinforcing cycle where each improvement expanded the capacity for the next. Many civilizations experience this pattern, but among the Tau, it was unusually concentrated because political unity reduced internal disruption, and the caste system ensured stable specialization. Education was another crucial component. Literacy and technical training expanded, particularly within the Earth and Air castes. Instruction was standardized and linked directly to state objectives. This ensured a continuous supply of engineers, technicians, and administrators prepared to serve in specific roles. Education was also ideological. The greater good was embedded into training programs, reinforcing the belief that knowledge existed to serve collective purpose. As the Air caste developed advanced aviation and navigation systems, the Tau achieved full planetary integration. Long-distance trade, administrative oversight, and rapid transport became normal. The Air caste's mastery of flight provided more than convenience. It trained an entire population segment in high-skill piloting, instrumentation. The transition of the Tau from a unified planetary civilization into an interstellar power marked the most decisive shift in their historical trajectory. Technological acceleration on the Homeworld had produced mature industrial capacity, sophisticated communications, and an increasingly standardized military apparatus. Yet none of these achievements alone constituted an empire. Expansion beyond Tau required a new scale of logistics, political planning, and strategic ambition. The First Sphere expansion became the institutional framework through which that ambition was executed. Early Tau space development was shaped by the same principles that defined their domestic consolidation: coordination, specialization, and ideological purpose. The Air Caste assumed primary responsibility for spacecraft operation, navigation, and long-range communication. Their experience in atmospheric flight and integrated transport networks made them the natural organizers of early void travel. Simultaneously, the Earth Caste directed engineering, ship construction, and the creation of life support systems capable of sustaining long-duration missions. These efforts were not isolated experiments. They were integrated into a state-supported program designed to extend Tau influence outward in a controlled and measurable manner. At the outset, the major challenge was not merely reaching orbit, but sustaining a permanent space presence and projecting settlement capability across interplanetary distances. Early spacecraft required reliable propulsion, radiation protection, durable materials, and standardized systems of repair. The Tau approach emphasized practical performance and repeatable production rather than singular revolutionary leaps. This method produced steady gains: orbital stations, improved sensor arrays, and increasingly complex vessels capable of extended voyages. Colonization required the establishment of sustainable industrial nodes beyond the Homeworld. The Tau caste therefore developed modular habitats, resource extraction equipment, and compact manufacturing systems. These allowed new colonies to reduce dependence on continuous supply shipments. Over time, this created a network of settlements able to function as semi-autonomous economic units while remaining politically subordinate to the central authority. The First Sphere expansion thus created not merely distant outposts, but an interconnected structure intended to grow into a coherent imperial body. In practical terms, the First Sphere expansion introduced the first true test of Tau administrative unity. Distance imposed delays in communication. Supply chains were vulnerable to miscalculation and disaster. Environmental conditions on new worlds often differed sharply from projections. To overcome these challenges, the Tau relied heavily on standardized procedures and carefully planned colonization doctrine. Settlements were designed to reproduce the social structure of the Homeworld, including caste separation, centralized governance, and ideological education. This ensured cultural continuity and reduced the risk of fragmentation. The First Sphere also established the strategic logic that would govern later expansion. Each new colony served multiple functions at once: population redistribution, resource acquisition, military staging capacity, and political legitimacy. Expansion itself became a symbol of success and proof of the Ethereals' leadership. As more worlds were settled, the Empire gained not only material strength, but psychological momentum. The Tau began to see themselves not as a species that had escaped internal war, but as a civilization with a historical mission. This period also revealed an important limitation. As the First Sphere expansion established a stable network of colonies, the Tau entered a new historical condition, the unavoidable reality of a populated galaxy. Until this point, expansion had been primarily a logistical and engineering problem, one shaped by distance, supply, and settlement viability. Contact with alien civilizations changed the strategic equation entirely. It introduced diplomacy, cultural conflict, and the possibility of war on a scale beyond anything the Tau had previously experienced. It also provided the opportunity that would define their empire, the transformation of a single species state into a multi-species political order. The earliest encounters revealed a key asymmetry. The Tau were technologically advanced by the standards of a rapidly modernizing civilization, but they were historically young and lacked deep experience in interstellar politics. Many neighboring species had long histories of territorial conflict, religious ideology, and survival under predatory imperial powers. The Tau response was shaped by their internal doctrine. Instead of treating aliens as existential threats by default, they framed them as potential participants in the greater good. This approach had both moral and strategic dimensions. It allowed the empire to expand influence without relying solely on force, and it offered a flexible framework for absorption rather than extermination. The water caste became central to this process. Diplomatic missions were expanded and professionalized, combining negotiation with psychological insight and careful propaganda. The goal was not only to secure treaties, but to reshape how alien populations interpreted their own survival. The Tau presented themselves as rational, stable, and progressive. They emphasized unity, prosperity, and the benefits of inclusion. This message was often contrasted with the brutality associated with other powers, particularly. This created the foundation of the auxiliary system. Non-Tau species were organized into roles that fit their strengths and strategic usefulness. Some became infantry and irregular forces, providing numbers and specialized environmental adaptation. Others contributed labor, trade networks, or technical expertise. The empire expanded not only in territory, but in functional capacity, gaining access to skills and biological advantages the Tau themselves did not possess. This was one of the most significant advantages of the Tau model. Unlike many empires that treated subject populations as expendable, the Tau structured incorporation around productivity and long-term stability. Integration also required control. The water caste managed information and public narrative, ensuring that newly incorporated populations received education in the greater good and that resistance ideology was isolated. The Ethereals provided ideological authority and served as the ultimate arbiters of inclusion. Under this system, loyalty was not merely enforced, it was cultivated. Public ceremonies, shared symbols, and participation in imperial institutions were designed to create emotional investment in the empire's future. The military implications were immediate. Multi-species auxiliaries expanded manpower and provided operational flexibility. Alien troops could be deployed in environments unsuitable for Tau physiology, and their cultural knowledge aided local governance. At the same time, this also introduced complexities. Managing competing traditions and preventing interspecies rivalry required constant political oversight. The Tau solution was centralized coordination and strict hierarchical order. The empire did not become a federation of equals. It remained a system where the Tau, guided by ethereal leadership, held. The rise of the Tau Empire could not remain unnoticed for long. As their colonies multiplied and their sphere of influence expanded, contact with the Imperium of Man became inevitable. This encounter represented more than a clash of armies. It was a collision between fundamentally different models of civilization. The Tau offered inclusion, controlled autonomy, and technological progress under centralized ideological rule. The Imperium offered conquest, absolute human supremacy, and the preservation of a vast ancient order through relentless militarism and religious certainty. The earliest conflicts did not begin as total war. Early Imperium responses were shaped by incomplete information and bureaucratic delay. Imperial authorities often treated the Tau as a minor Xenos civilization, one more frontier anomaly to be suppressed or ignored, depending on available resources. Yet as reports accumulated, it became clear that this was not a scattered alien tribe. It was an organized interstellar polity with coherent doctrine, growing military capability, and an unusually effective diplomatic strategy. The earliest clashes occurred along frontier zones where Tau expansion intersected with human-controlled worlds. In these regions, Imperium governance was often harsh and inefficient, leaving local populations vulnerable to disorder and resentment. The Tau exploited this strategically. Caste envoys and information campaigns offered an alternative: security, stable administration, and material improvement under the greater good. In some cases, human populations defected or cooperated, not out of ideological conversion, but out of pragmatic survival. From the Imperium perspective, such outcomes were intolerable. They represented not only territorial loss, but contamination of loyalty. Imperial military response intensified as the threat was understood. The first significant wars established patterns that would define later conflict. The Imperium's strength lay in its capacity to absorb loss. It could deploy vast numbers of troops, accept catastrophic attrition, and continue fighting as long as command structures remained intact. This created a strategic dilemma for the Tau. Tactical superiority in individual battles did not guarantee long-term security if the Imperium chose to escalate. The Imperium could draw on fleets, regiments, and war machines accumulated over millennia. Against such depth, the Tau needed speed, adaptability, and the ability to win wars through political collapse rather than mere destruction. This is where Tau diplomacy became a weapon. The Caste did not cease operations during war. Instead, it intensified propaganda aimed at destabilizing imperial control over frontier populations. Messages emphasized the Imperium's indifference to human suffering and contrasted it with Tau administrative efficiency. Even when direct conversion was rare, doubt itself could weaken resistance. In certain contested systems, the Tau achieved victories by inducing surrender, negotiated compliance, or internal fracture rather than full-scale annihilation. Early wars also forced rapid technological refinement. The Caste accelerated weapons development, armor systems, drones, and battlefield communication tools. Combat data was converted into design improvements with remarkable speed. The Fire Caste adapted Doctrine to counter Imperial tactics, including mass infantry assaults and heavy armored spearheads. The Air Caste expanded void and atmospheric coordination, supporting planetary campaigns with increasingly complex logistical control. These initial conflicts demonstrated that the Tau were not merely colonizers, but capable military strategists. They could challenge Imperial forces in limited theater. The early wars against the Imperium produced a lesson the Tau could not ignore. Their survival would not be secured solely through tactical competence or ideological appeal. The Imperium possessed overwhelming depth, and even limited Imperial attention could threaten young colonies. If the Tau wished to endure, they required strategic depth of their own, more worlds, stronger logistics, broader manpower, and greater industrial output. This need shaped the Second Sphere expansion, an era of accelerated growth that transformed the empire from a compact cluster of colonies into a rapidly expanding regional power. Unlike the First Sphere expansion, which emphasized controlled settlement and gradual consolidation, the Second Sphere was driven by urgency. It was planned as a deliberate surge outward, aimed at securing resources, buffering frontier zones, and increasing the political and military resilience of the empire. The Ethereals framed the expansion as a necessary step in the historical mission of the greater good. They presented growth as both defensive requirement and moral destiny, linking survival to continued unity and outward action. This era relied heavily on improvements in logistics and shipbuilding. The Earth Caste expanded industrial capacity to produce larger fleets, more colony modules, and standardized defensive infrastructure. The Air Caste improved long-range navigation, supply scheduling, and fleet coordination. Expansion was no longer only a matter of sending settlers into uncertainty. It became a disciplined process with repeatable methods, recon surveys, controlled landings, rapid construction of orbital facilities, and deployment of protective garrisons. Colonies were designed to become productive quickly, reducing vulnerability during their early years. The Fire Caste gained increasing prominence during this period. As the empire expanded into contested regions, military force became an inseparable component of colonization. Defensive doctrine was integrated directly into settlement planning. New worlds were not merely inhabited, they were fortified, structured to resist assault. Diplomacy remained essential. The Water Caste intensified contact with neighboring species and frontier populations, offering inclusion as an alternative to annihilation or exploitation. This was not an idealistic project detached from strategy. Multi-species incorporation expanded the empire's reach without requiring proportional Tau population growth. Auxiliary forces provided manpower and specialized capabilities, while alien industrial and agricultural systems added economic depth. The Second Sphere thus expanded not only territory, but internal complexity, creating an empire increasingly defined by multi-species structure. Rapid growth also brought political risks. Expansion pressures can fracture unity as distant colonies develop local identities and leadership interests. The Tau leadership acted to prevent this through administrative design. Governance structures were replicated across colonies with standardized institutions, caste arrangements, and ideological education systems. Loyalty was cultivated through ritual and civic integration. Communication networks were prioritized to ensure that the central state retained oversight. The Ethereals maintained authority as the ultimate coordinators, ensuring that expansion did not produce independent power centers. A crucial characteristic of the second sphere was acceleration of military-industrial integration. Research, production, and combat experience formed a continuous cycle. The Tau Earth Caste used battlefield data to refine weapons, drones, armor. The rapid growth of the second sphere expansion forced the Tau to refine not only technology and logistics, but the underlying principles of how they fought wars. Their enemies were not limited to the Imperium. Expansion inevitably brought contact with hostile species, raiders, and unpredictable frontier conflicts. The Tau response was the development of a coherent doctrine that emphasized modern war in its most systematic form: precision, coordination, and strategic economy of force. Unlike many galactic powers that relied on ancient traditions, fanaticism, or brute attrition, Tau doctrine was shaped by rational planning and continuous adaptation. At the core of Tau military thinking lay a simple assumption: survival required efficiency. The Empire could not afford the vast casualties routinely tolerated by the Imperium, orcs, or other brutal powers. Tau population density and recruitment capacity were limited compared to the massive manpower pools of ancient civilizations. Therefore, Tau warfare was designed to achieve objectives with minimal loss and maximal control of the battlefield. This logic reinforced their preference for ranged engagement and layered firepower, supported by mobility and information dominance. Tau doctrine emphasized combined arms integration. Firecast units were trained to operate as interlocking components rather than isolated formations. Infantry, armor, artillery equivalents, air support, and drones were coordinated through advanced communication networks. The goal was to deny enemies the chance to fight on their own terms. Rather than meeting mass assaults head-on, Tau forces aimed to fragment enemy formations through precision strikes, isolate leadership, and collapse momentum before it could reach decisive close combat. Mobility was another central concept. Tau commanders sought to control distance. This was not simply a preference, but a survival requirement. Many opponents excelled in close engagement, particularly forces such as Imperial assault units and orc hordes. The Tau response was to treat battlefield space as a weapon. Units were trained to reposition rapidly, withdraw while firing, and use terrain for controlled engagement zones. Mechanized transport, grav vehicles, and air insertion allowed rapid information warfare, in the literal sense of battlefield intelligence, played an unusually large role. Sensors, targeting systems, reconnaissance drones, and integrated command networks allowed Tau units to identify threats earlier and strike more accurately. This created an advantage against forces reliant on visual confirmation, slow communication chains, or rigid command structures. The Tau sought to fight wars as systems rather than as sequences of heroic confrontations. Victory depended on detection, coordination, and the efficient application of firepower. Tau doctrine also placed emphasis on escalation control. Warfare was not treated as a sacred struggle demanding total destruction. It was treated as a political instrument. Firecast campaigns were designed around defined objectives: securing worlds, removing hostile leadership, defending borders or forcing negotiation. This approach aligned with the water caste's parallel operations. Military action could create conditions for diplomatic settlement. Likewise, diplomatic destabilization could create openings for rapid military victory. The Tau treated war and diplomacy as complementary tools rather than separate spheres. At the strategic level, Tau forces relied on the concept of decisive engagement through concentration. Rather than the most recognizable feature of the Tau military system is not its infantry formations or armored columns, but the integration of advanced battlesuit technology and autonomous drone networks into nearly every level of combat. These systems reflect the broader logic of Tau warfare: maximize battlefield effect while minimizing the exposure of personnel. Where many powers accept high casualties as the natural cost of war, the Tau have pursued a different model, using machinery, sensors, and precision weapons to substitute for manpower. This technological philosophy became a cornerstone of their strategic identity. Battlesuits emerged from the Earth caste's long-term investment in powered armor, grav propulsion, and weapons miniaturization. Early designs focused on enhancing Firecaste mobility and survivability. Over time, battlesuits evolved into a family of specialized platforms, each optimized for a particular operational role: infantry support, heavy assault, rapid strike, or command coordination. The battlesuit concept was not merely the creation of a stronger soldier. It was the creation of a modular combat system in which pilot, suit, sensors, and drones formed a unified weapons network. A key advantage of battlesuits lies in their integration of mobility and firepower. Many designs employ jump capabilities, allowing units to reposition rapidly, strike from unexpected angles, and withdraw before enemies can close for decisive melee. This reinforces the core Tau doctrine of distance control. Battlesuits are not intended to hold ground through brute endurance, but to dominate the engagement zone through superior movement and concentrated fire. In practical terms, this enables smaller Tau forces to disrupt larger enemy formations by targeting critical assets, command nodes, and heavy weapons units. Drone warfare represents the second pillar of Tau technological superiority. Drones serve as reconnaissance platforms. The integration of drones into command systems also supports rapid decision-making. Drones gather data, relay targeting information, and enable coordinated strikes across dispersed units. This creates a form of distributed battlefield intelligence that is difficult for less technologically integrated armies to match. While Imperial forces often rely on human scouts, rigid chain of command, and slower target acquisition, Tau units can operate as coordinated sensor webs. This does not remove the need for commanders, but it increases the speed and accuracy with which commanders can act. Technological superiority in the Tau case is not limited to hardware. It is embedded in the industrial system that produces, repairs, and upgrades equipment rapidly. The Earth caste's culture of standardization and iterative development ensures that combat lessons translate quickly into improved designs. This creates an innovation cycle where each campaign strengthens the next. Older powers may possess formidable ancient weapons, but their ability to adjust is often limited by tradition, bureaucracy, or reliance on irreplaceable relic technology. The Tau, being young, build equipment that is designed to be replaced, improved, and mass-produced. This advantage has strategic implications beyond individual battles. Battlesuits and drones allow the Tau to project force efficiently across multiple fronts. A battlesuit pilot can deliver a disproportionate level of firepower compared to conventional infantry. Drones can fill gaps in defense networks without requiring large garrisons. In frontier zones, these systems provide flexible security with reduced manpower demand, supporting expansion while maintaining internal stability. Yet technological dependence also imposes vulnerabilities. Battlesuits require trained pilots, maintenance infrastructure, while Tau military doctrine relies on technology and precision warfare. The expansion of their empire cannot be explained through combat alone. From its earliest interstellar encounters, the Tau demonstrated a strategic preference for achieving objectives without prolonged destructive campaigns. This preference was not merely humanitarian, it was structural. The Empire's long-term strength depends on preserving productive worlds, incorporating populations intact, and minimizing losses that a young civilization cannot easily replace. Therefore, diplomacy, propaganda, and cultural assimilation became core instruments of imperial power, not secondary tools. The water caste was the central institution of this strategy. Trained in negotiation, political psychology, and interspecies communication, water caste envoys served as the primary interface between the Empire and external populations. Their missions rarely relied solely on diplomatic formality. They combined economic incentive, information control, and ideological messaging into an integrated approach designed to transform how societies understood their future. In this model, conquest was reframed as recruitment. Tau diplomacy operated through a consistent set of themes. The Empire presented itself as rational, efficient, and benevolent. It offered stability in regions where local governance was weak or predatory. It offered technological improvement and material prosperity in exchange for cooperation. Most importantly, it offered inclusion within an organized political system, framed not as submission, but as participation in the greater good. This messaging was particularly effective among worlds suffering under exploitation, internal conflict, or imperial neglect, conditions common in frontier zones contested by older powers. Propaganda was not treated as crude deception, but systematic governance. Information management was designed to shape identity formation, not only in newly contacted societies, but within the empire itself. The greater good functioned as an ideological framework that could absorb diversity while maintaining hierarchy. External populations were encouraged. Cultural assimilation often followed a recognizable pattern. First came contact and negotiation, with water caste envoys offering trade and security arrangements. Second came the establishment of permanent advisory presences, political liaison offices, and economic support programs. Third came integration into imperial institutions. Local elites were offered status and influence within the imperial framework, provided they aligned publicly with Tau authority. Finally came education, the long-term foundation of loyalty. Schools, administrative training, and public ceremonies embedded the greater good into daily life, ensuring that new generations would view the empire as normal rather than foreign. Economic policy served as both incentive and control mechanism. The Tau offered access to advanced technology, organized trade networks, and industrial planning assistance. In exchange, integrated worlds were expected to meet production targets, provide labor or military auxiliaries, and accept administrative oversight. This created mutual dependence. Local economies benefited from imperial coordination, but became structurally tied to it. Over time, resistance became costly because withdrawal threatened prosperity and security. The role of propaganda also extended into conflict zones. During wars with the Imperium, the Tau actively targeted human frontier populations with messages emphasizing the Imperium's indifference and brutality. This approach did not always produce mass conversion, but it could destabilize loyalty and reduce local willingness to resist. Even minor shifts in population cooperation could affect supply lines, intelligence gathering, and administrative control. In this way, information warfare became a strategic force multiplier. Assimilation did not mean equal political status. The empire remained hierarchical. The expansion of the Tau Empire produced a political structure unusual among major galactic powers, a multi-species state organized not as a loose coalition, but as an integrated system designed around functional inclusion. Where the Imperium of Man defined itself through exclusivity and extermination, and where many alien empires enforced dominance through slavery or terror, the Tau developed a model in which subject species were offered conditional partnership. This approach was not simply ideological, it was strategically efficient. By incorporating auxiliaries, the empire expanded manpower, gained specialized capabilities, and extended influence faster than its own demographic base would otherwise allow. Auxiliaries were not treated as temporary allies, they were incorporated into imperial planning. The water caste managed recruitment and loyalty cultivation through negotiation, material incentives, and ideological education. The Earth caste integrated auxiliary industrial resources into wider production networks. The Fire caste structured alien military units into operational roles that complemented Tau Doctrine. This multi-layered integration created an imperial structure that could project power while maintaining a relatively smaller core Tau population. Auxiliary military forces became particularly important. Many incorporated species possessed strengths the Tau lacked: resilience in extreme environments, superior close combat capacity, or familiarity with local terrain and survival conditions. The Tau used these advantages to compensate for doctrinal limitations. While the Fire caste emphasized ranged engagement and precision maneuver, auxiliaries could hold ground, conduct reconnaissance in hostile terrain, and fight in environments where battlesuits and drone systems were less effective. In practice, this political administration of auxiliary worlds followed standardized patterns. Local elites were often preserved and redirected rather than eliminated. Cooperation was rewarded through access to imperial trade networks and infrastructure development. Resistance, when it occurred, was addressed through combined political pressure and selective military intervention. The Tau generally avoided indiscriminate destruction because their model depended on preserving populations as productive assets. This preservation was itself a strategic advantage, allowing newly integrated worlds to become contributors rather than burdens. Cultural management was essential. The empire did not demand uniformity of language, religion, or tradition in all aspects of life. Instead, it demanded political loyalty and compliance with imperial order. Water caste programs emphasized ideological education, public rituals and the symbolic incorporation of local identities into the empire's narrative. The objective was to produce a sense of belonging without requiring complete assimilation. In practice, this often meant creating hybrid civic identities, where local culture persisted but was framed as a component of the greater good. Economically, auxiliaries strengthened the empire's resilience. Diverse species contributed labor patterns, agricultural methods, and regional trade connections. The Earth Caste incorporated these into wider industrial planning, allocating production quotas and coordinating resource flows. This allowed the empire to avoid overdependence on any single world or region. It also increased the complexity of imperial governance, requiring continuous administrative oversight and reliable communication systems. The military and economic benefits of auxiliaries came with strategic complications. Multi-species empires must manage the risk of rivalry, rebellion, and divided loyalty. This is especially true in a galaxy where external powers exploit internal fracture through sabotage, propaganda, or direct alliance building. The Tau responded to tight central control combined with ideological framing. Auxiliaries were encouraged to view their security as dependent on imperial unity. Disputes were mediated through water caste administration, while the presence of fire caste garrisons and rapid response forces acted as deterrents. In this system, integration was both opportunity and surveillance. The auxiliary system also shaped the empire's long-term identity. It reinforced the Tau claim that they represented a progressive model of civilization, one capable of organizing diverse species towards shared prosperity. Yet it also revealed the limits of that claim. Inclusion was conditional, hierarchy remained strict, and ultimate power rested in the hands of a ruling caste that defined loyalty as moral necessity. This balance between cooperation and control would become increasingly important as the empire expanded into more dangerous fronts.
The Third Sphere expansion marked a new phase in Tau history, defined not only by growth but by risk. Earlier expansions had built strategic depth and integrated surrounding regions through settlement, diplomacy, and selective warfare. By the time the Third Sphere was initiated, the empire had matured into a more... The Third Sphere expansion marked a new phase in Tau history, defined not only by growth but by risk. Earlier expansions had built strategic depth and integrated surrounding regions through settlement, diplomacy, and selective warfare. By the time the Third Sphere was initiated, the empire had matured into a multi-world power with a complex auxiliary structure and increasingly sophisticated military systems. Yet the strategic environment around it had also hardened. The Imperium had begun treating the Tau as a persistent threat. Rival alien powers contested border space, and the geography of the galaxy itself imposed limits through distance, supply vulnerability, and the dangers of warp-adjacent phenomena. The Third Sphere expansion was designed to overcome these constraints by pushing into new regions and opening additional fronts for influence. Its planners understood that a compact empire could be strangled. Expansion was therefore treated as both opportunity and necessity. New territories would provide resources, population centers, and forward operating zones. They would also complicate enemy planning by forcing opponents to split attention across multiple theaters. This expansion phase required improvements in strategic mobility.
Without the stable warp travel methods used by older civilizations, the Tau relied on alternative solutions, improved propulsion, better navigation, and tightly coordinated fleet logistics. The air caste played a decisive role, developing methods to move large expeditionary forces with minimal loss. The Earth caste, in parallel, increased ship production and built modular infrastructure capable of rapid deployment. Expansion fleets were planned not only.
New fronts also adapted in political strategy. The Water Caste expanded diplomatic operations to manage increasingly complex relationships with non-aligned worlds. Some regions contained species willing to negotiate. Others contained populations shaped by long-standing hostility to external rule. The empire therefore refined its methods of incorporation. Instead of relying primarily on persuasion, Tau policy increasingly combined incentives with containment. Worlds that accepted integration were supported and modernized. Worlds that resisted were isolated, pressured economically, and confronted with controlled force where necessary. The Third Sphere also intensified military modernization. The Fire Caste expanded expeditionary doctrine, emphasizing flexible task forces rather than slow mass campaigns. Battlesuits, drones, and precision strike assets became central to rapid front creation. The goal was not merely to win battles, but to create security conditions in which governance could follow. A conquered or persuaded world had to be stabilized quickly before enemy forces could reclaim it or local resistance could reorganize. Opening new fronts inevitably increased exposure to hostile response. Expansion routes and new holdings became targets for Imperial counterattacks and raids by other powers. This forced the empire into a broader defensive posture. Supply lines required protection. Patrol fleets multiplied. The empire began treating interstellar space not as empty distance, but as contested terrain. This increased strategic strain. Every new world added resources, but it also added obligations. The Third Sphere expansion thus represented a turning point. The empire became large enough that its survival depended on continuous management of multiple theaters. It could no longer concentrate all strength on a single frontier. Instead, it had to maintain presence across wide. The Damocles Gulf became one of the most symbolically important and strategically decisive frontiers in the history of the Tau Empire. It represented the point where expansion collided with a sustained and organized imperial effort to contain, punish, and reverse Tau growth. Earlier conflicts with the Imperium had been fragmented, influenced by local commanders, delayed bureaucracy, and limited resource allocation. In the Damocles Gulf region, resistance hardened into a structured response. For the Tau, the Gulf became both a proving ground for their doctrine and a reminder of the scale of the enemy they had awakened. The geographic character of the region shaped its strategic value. As a contested boundary zone between Tau spheres of influence and Imperial-held space, it contained worlds of varying loyalty, economic importance, and military vulnerability. Control over these systems influenced trade routes, fleet movement corridors, and the ability to project power deeper into enemy territory. For the Tau, holding the Damocles frontier was essential to prevent encirclement. For the Imperium, it was essential to prevent further ideological and territorial loss. Imperial operations in this region often followed a familiar pattern.
Initial probes were followed by larger military deployments, frequently involving naval assets, planetary assault forces, and heavy mechanized regiments. The Imperium's doctrine favored overwhelming violence aimed at breaking resistance quickly through fear and destruction. In the Imperial worldview, the existence of a Xenos empire was an offense that justified unlimited force. This ideological absolutism shaped Imperial resistance. Even tactical setbacks did not weaken the long-term objective of elimination. Tau's strategy in the Damocles Gulf combined defense, selective offense, and political destabilization. The Fire Caste sought to defeat Imperial assaults through layered firepower, mobile battlesuit strikes, drone-supported reconnaissance, and rapid redeployment. Defensive positions were designed.
At the same time, the Water Caste intensified operations aimed at undermining Imperial control of border worlds. Many Imperial frontier systems suffered from harsh governance and inadequate protection. The Tau offered stability, economic improvement, and the promise of rational administration. Even when conversions were rare, the presence of an alternative weakened Imperial legitimacy. In contested systems, the Tau often gained advantage by encouraging surrender, negotiated neutrality, or limited cooperation that disrupted Imperial campaigns from within. The Damocles Gulf conflicts also revealed the limits of Tau methods. Imperial forces could absorb enormous casualties and continue fighting, pushing engagements toward prolonged war. For the Tau, prolonged war threatened the very foundations of their expansion model. Their manpower pools were smaller, and their empire could not sustain endless attrition without undermining industrial growth and political stability. This required the Tau to focus on operational solutions rather than simple defensive endurance. They sought to break Imperial campaigns through disruption, destroying supply lines, eliminating command infrastructure, and forcing withdrawal by making occupation unsustainable. In space, fleet conflict played an increasing role. The Imperium possessed ancient void war capability and often fielded massive warships built for direct confrontation. The Tau fleets relied on coordination, targeting accuracy, and the integration of technological systems designed for efficient engagement. The Damocles front thus became a test of fleet evolution. Tau naval doctrine emphasized controlled engagement, avoiding unnecessary losses while delivering concentrated strikes against vulnerable elements. The outcome was not absolute superiority, but the creation of a contested balance where, as the Tau Empire expanded through multiple spheres and absorbed an increasing number of auxiliary populations, it entered a stage of development where external threats were no longer the only strategic concern. Growth produced internal pressures that tested the cohesion of the Imperial system. These pressures did not necessarily appear as open rebellion or immediate collapse. Instead, they emerged as tensions embedded in governance, culture, military planning, and the management of diversity. In a civilization built upon unity, even subtle instability carried significant long-term risk. The first major source of strain was imperial scale. The early empire had been compact, with strong communication links and uniform cultural expectation. As the empire grew, distance and administrative complexity increased. Colonies and annexed worlds developed distinct local conditions, different resource profiles, different security needs, and different cultural environments. Central governance sought to maintain standardized institutions, but local adaptation was unavoidable.
This created friction between the Empire's ideological emphasis on uniform collective purpose and the practical reality of multi-world diversity. The caste system, while an instrument of stability, also generated rigidity. Specialized roles ensured efficiency, but they limited flexibility in responding to new challenges. As new technologies and new forms of warfare emerged, the need for innovation sometimes collided with institutional boundaries. The Earth caste required freedom to experiment, yet remained subordinate to political oversight. The Fire caste required doctrinal autonomy, yet remained dependent on ethereal direction and Water caste political management. Over time, these structural constraints could produce discontent, particularly when castes perceived that their sacrifices were not matched by influence. The most complex tensions emerged from the Empire's multi-species composition. Auxiliary incorporation expanded imperial strength, but it also created a society where many populations served under Tau leadership without full political equality. The Empire's propaganda emphasized partnership and shared destiny, yet the hierarchy was clear. This could produce resentment among subject species, especially when they faced disproportionate military burdens or cultural restrictions. The Water caste worked to manage these pressures through ideological education, economic development programs, and controlled cultural tolerance. However, security pressures intensified these tensions. Border worlds lived under constant threat from Imperial attacks, Orc incursions, and other hostile forces. In such regions, garrisoning and militarization increased. Fire caste authority could become more pronounced, and emergency measures could restrict civilian autonomy. These policies were framed as necessary for collective survival, but they could also generate local frustration. A citizen living under continuous war conditions experiences imperial ideology differently than a citizen in the stable, poor worlds. This created divergence in lived experience, which ideology alone could not fully erase. Economic planning also created pressure. The Empire's centralized resource allocation system depended on predictable production and stable distribution. Expansion disrupted this predictability. New worlds required initial investment and could become dependent before becoming productive. Defense spending increased due to constant frontier conflict. Industrial nodes had to balance civilian development with military demand. In such a system, shortages or delays could have ideological consequences, undermining the promise that unity guarantees prosperity. The Empire therefore had to maintain legitimacy through visible improvements, making economic management an essential political task. Information control became more critical. A young empire facing constant conflict is vulnerable to ideological fracture. The Water caste expanded internal propaganda to sustain morale and reinforce loyalty. No institution in the Tau Empire is more central and more contested than the Ethereals. They are the architects of unification, the guardians of the greater good, and the final authority over imperial strategy. Their rise ended the destructive tribal wars of the Homeworld and enabled the rapid transformation of the Tau into a multi-world state. Yet the very concentration of authority that made expansion possible also generated persistent questions. What sustains ethereal control, how that control is exercised, and what consequences follow from a political system that grants one caste ideological monopoly? The Ethereals occupy a position unlike any other caste. They are not defined by industrial function, military duty, diplomacy, or logistics. They define the framework within which all functions operate. The greater good, as doctrine, is interpreted through ethereal authority. In practical terms, this gives the Ethereals the power to set priorities for expansion, resource allocation, military campaigns, and integration policy. Their legitimacy derives from the historical memory of unification, but it is continuously reinforced through institutional design. Political control within the empire operates through layered mechanisms. The first is cultural and ideological. From early education onward, loyalty to the greater good is taught as moral necessity. Ethereals are depicted as the necessary coordinators of civilization, positioned above factional interest. This framing does not merely glorify leadership, it reduces the possibility of alternate political legitimacy. If unity is a moral requirement, then opposition becomes not a political stance, but a form of selfishness. This ideological environment shapes behavior before coercion is ever required. The second mechanism is administrative architecture. The empire's institutions are designed to prevent independent power centers from emerging. Caste specialization limits the ability of any one functional group to dominate society as a whole. The fire caste is armed and disciplined, but it lacks administrative authority and industrial control. The earth caste has technological capacity, but it lacks military command. The water caste holds propaganda and diplomacy, but it lacks direct coercive power. The air caste controls fleets, but it is structurally dependent on other castes for resources and support. Above them, Ethereals coordinate, ensuring interdependence and preventing unified resistance.
The third mechanism is direct political supervision. Ethereals maintain presence within key military and administrative structures. Their influence over fire caste leadership is particularly significant. Military commanders often accept ethereal guidance as essential not only for legitimacy, but for cohesion. This relationship ensures that the military remains a tool of state ideology rather than an independent political actor. For an empire that depends on disciplined expansion and suppression of internal fracture, preventing military autonomy is an existential requirement. The question of how Ethereals maintain obedience has long been a subject of external speculation and internal sensitivity. Within Imperial narrative, their authority is presented as natural, rational, and freely accepted by all castes. In practice, the consistency of obedience across regions and generations suggests a combination of belief, institutional reinforcement, and social pressure. Loyalty is cultivated through reward structures, career advancement, honor systems, and public recognition. Those who serve faithfully gain status and security. Those who challenge authority risk marginalization or removal from influence. In multi-species contexts, ethereal political control takes a different form. Subject species do not share the ancestral memory of Tau unification. Their loyalty must be constructed through incentive and narrative management rather than cultural inheritance. The water caste plays the front-line role, but ethereal authority remains the final anchor. Auxiliaries are taught that the Ethereals embody stability and coordination. Compliance is rewarded with prosperity and protection. Resistance is framed as disorder that threatens collective survival. In this way, ethereal legitimacy is exported as part of imperial governance. This system creates a political paradox. The empire presents itself as inclusive and progressive, yet it operates through strict ideological centralization. The history of the Tau Empire is defined by rational planning, technological progress,
and ideological discipline. Yet as the Empire expanded into wider galactic space, it encountered realities that do not yield to reason or industrial method. Chief among these are the warp and the forces associated with chaos. For older civilizations, the warp is both highway and nightmare, enabling interstellar travel while exposing fleets and worlds to corruption, invasion, and metaphysical instability. For the Tau, whose development occurred largely outside deep warp tradition, contact with these forces represented not only a strategic challenge, but an existential conceptual shock. The Tau species is generally noted for a limited psychic presence compared to many other sentient populations. This characteristic had profound implications. It reduced their early exposure to warp predation and limited the immediate threat of spontaneous psychic disaster within their population. It also meant that their civilization developed without the religious and metaphysical frameworks that dominate human imperial culture. The Tau approached the galaxy as engineers and planners, not as mystics. In many environments, this gave them an advantage. They were less vulnerable to superstition, less burdened by ancient taboo, and more willing to treat unknown phenomena as problems to be studied. However, limited psychic presence did not equal immunity. As the Empire expanded and encountered warp-active species, chaos-tainted regions, and Imperial forces deeply entangled with warp practice, the Tau were exposed. Conflict with chaos-aligned forces revealed doctrinal limitations. Tau military systems were designed for modern warfare against material enemies, formations, vehicles, and infrastructure. Demonic entities and warp-based phenomena do not always conform to such targets. Conventional firepower can destroy physical bodies, but does not eliminate the underlying warp presence that sustains invasion. Furthermore, chaos warfare is often psychological and corrosive. It seeks to fracture loyalty, inspire despair, and cultivate internal betrayal. These methods strike at the foundations of the greater good by turning unity into vulnerability. The Empire responded through multiple layers of containment. First was information control. The Water Caste restricted dissemination of knowledge about chaos, framing unexplained events as isolated anomalies rather than metaphysical threats. This prevented panic, but it also limited public understanding. Second was security enforcement. Internal surveillance and counter-subversion operations expanded, targeting signs of cult formation or ideological deviation. The Fire Caste provided rapid response forces to contain outbreaks before they could spread. Third was alliance management. Auxiliary species with greater experience of warp threats could provide warnings and specialized expertise, though such reliance created additional political complexity. Exposure to chaos also had ideological consequences. The Ethereals, particularly those on the extreme of the Empire's loyalty spectrum, based the greater good on the assumption that rational unity produces stability and progress. Chaos represents a direct contradiction, an external force that thrives on emotion, irrationality, and spiritual corruption. To acknowledge chaos fully would require admitting that not all threats are material and that not all dangers can be solved through planning. This tension encouraged the Empire to treat chaos as an adversary to be suppressed and denied, rather than confronted openly. By the era of the modern Tau Empire, expansion has ceased to be a frontier experiment and has become a permanent condition of state identity. The empire is no longer defined solely by youth or novelty. It has accumulated decades of continuous warfare, multi-sphere colonization, and the integration of diverse auxiliary populations. These pressures have reshaped imperial priorities. The modern empire's strategic posture is defined by three priorities: consolidation of existing holdings, controlled outward growth, and denial of enemy penetration. Consolidation requires maintaining stability across diverse worlds, ensuring economic integration and preventing fragmentation. Controlled growth demands the opening of new fronts where expansion offers net strategic gain rather than reckless overreach. Denial requires constant defense readiness along contested borders, particularly where imperial resistance persists and where other hostile powers can exploit gaps. Modern military planning reflects an increasingly mature understanding of enemy diversity. The Fire Caste no longer prepares only for imperial mass warfare. It prepares for multiple categories of conflict: mechanized campaigns, raiding warfare, close combat shock assaults, and irregular insurgency on annexed worlds. This has driven further specialization in battlesuit roles, drone applications, and combined arms doctrine. The modern Tau military seeks to fight wars as systems, integrating intelligence, firepower, mobility, and political operations into a single operational framework.
Fleet strategy has also expanded. The Air Caste operates increasingly complex void assets, supporting not only defense, but long-range expeditionary operations. Interstellar warfare requires control of supply routes and staging corridors. The Empire's ambition therefore depends on maintaining fleet presence across multiple theaters. This is a strain on resources, and it forces constant industrial output. The Earth Caste remains essential to maintaining this tempo, producing ships, weapons systems, and colony infrastructure, while also upgrading existing platforms based on battlefield lessons. Diplomacy remains an instrument of ambition, but it has become more cautious. The Water Caste continues to pursue incorporation of new populations, but now faces greater resistance from societies shaped by fear of Xenos rule or hardened by long conflict. The Empire therefore uses diplomacy in layered form: negotiation where possible, destabilization where useful, and containment where incorporation is too costly. Economic leverage is deployed as a strategic tool, offering trade access and technology in exchange for loyalty. Propaganda continues to frame the Empire as a rational force in an irrational galaxy, but modern messaging increasingly emphasizes survival and discipline rather than idealistic uplift. Auxiliaries play an even greater role than before. The Empire's multi-species structure has expanded both capability and governance burden. Modern imperial administration must manage not only Tau castes, but also alien populations with distinct traditions and historical grievances. The strategic advantage of auxiliaries is clear: manpower, adaptation, and regional knowledge. The strategic risk is equally clear: internal fracture under stress. This risk is managed through surveillance, ideological education, and the continued central authority of the Ethereals. Stability is treated as a security problem, not merely a cultural process. The modern empire is therefore defined by a balance between expansion and control. It must grow to survive, but growth creates vulnerability.
It must incorporate populations, but incorporation increases internal complexity. It must fight efficiently, but enemies can force attritional engagement through scale or brutality. Under these conditions, the Empire's long-term ambition
The Tau Empire occupies a unique position in the wider history of the galaxy. It is a young interstellar power that rose not from ancient conquest or inherited relic systems, but from rapid modernization guided by ideological unity and structured specialization. In an era dominated by civilizations defined by millennia of war, collapse, and stagnation, the Tau represent the contrasting phenomenon, a state still expanding in confidence, still capable of reform, and still driven by a coherent narrative of progress. Yet the galaxy into which they have expanded is not neutral terrain. It is a system shaped by constant conflict, metaphysical instability, and predatory empires. The long-term historical role of the Tau must therefore be evaluated as a contest between ambition and environment. From a structural perspective, the Tau are a case study in accelerated empire formation. Their unity was achieved through centralized authority, reinforced by the caste system and the doctrine of the greater good. This allowed them to convert industrial development into interstellar projection within a relatively short period. Their success demonstrates that even in a galaxy dominated by older powers, youth can provide strategic advantages. The Tau are less burdened by ancient tradition, less trapped by rigid bureaucracy, and more willing to treat doctrine as adaptable rather than sacred. This adaptability has enabled rapid technological iteration and military evolution, allowing them to survive encounters that might have destroyed less coherent rising powers. Their long-term influence is also tied to their imperial model. The Tau offer conditional inclusion rather than extermination. This multi-species integration strategy differentiates them sharply from the Imperium and many other powers. In practical terms, it allows the Empire to expand manpower and capability without needing vast Tau population growth. It also creates a political narrative of legitimacy. The Empire claims to be building a collective order rather than imposing domination for its own sake. Over time, this model could reshape frontier politics. Worlds and species trapped between predatory empires may view the Tau.
The greatest long-term limitation on the Tau is scale. Even after multiple expansions, they remain smaller than the Imperium, the Orc threat zones, and other sprawling powers. Their ability to win wars relies on efficiency and precision. Yet the galaxy frequently rewards mass and brutality. If the Tau are drawn into prolonged attritional war, their demographic and industrial base may be strained beyond sustainable limits. Their long-term strategy must therefore avoid direct engagement on enemy terms. It must continue to rely on selective conflict, political destabilization of opponents, and the creation of defense networks that make invasion too costly to pursue. Another factor shaping their historical role is the warp. The Tau have been partly shielded from warp-based instability due to limited psychic presence and technological approach. Yet, as their empire expands, exposure increases. Warp storms, chaos corruption, and demonic incursions are not problems that can be solved purely through engineering. They introduce uncertainty that challenges the rational foundations of Tau ideology. The way the Empire addresses this will shape its future. If denial persists, vulnerabilities may expand silently. If acknowledgement grows, ideological stability may weaken. This is a strategic dilemma without simple resolution. The Ethereals remain the key variable. Their authority created unity, accelerated expansion, and prevented internal collapse. Yet their concentration of power also creates systemic dependence. If ethereal legitimacy holds, the empire may continue expanding as a disciplined project. If it fractures, the caste system could become an engine of rivalry, and auxiliaries could become vectors of separatism. The empire's long-term stability is therefore tied to the durability of centralized ideological control, and to whether that control can adapt to pressures without becoming brittle. In the long arc of galactic history, the Tau may serve as a catalyst rather than a conqueror. They challenge established assumptions about what power must look like. They demonstrate that ideology and planning can produce rapid imperial growth even in hostile environments. Their presence complicates imperial frontier stability and offers alternative political options to threatened populations. Even if contained, they may exert influence through disruption of older systems and through the spread of their model across contested zones.